All right, it is time that we look at an example of how we might solve a problem using functional programming techniques. Now, there is still a lot to introduce as far as FP techniques go, but this example illustrates the thought process and approach very well. Now, this particular example I have adapted from an example used by Federico Caricchi in his very useful book, Mastering JavaScript Functional Programming, by Pack Publishing. I highly recommend the book for those that want to dive deeper into FP. I'm going to simplify and change a bit of the example and the discussion to emphasize what I think are the salient points. Okay, now imagine this. Here's our example. You have a function that is invoked on the click of a button, but you only want the function to execute once for a session on the web page. For the sake of this example, we will call the function countSession. We're going to deal with that problem first, and then I'm going to add a little bit to the example to give it another twist. So, to the code. All right, here is our function. Now, I haven't put a lot of the code in there because that's not really important. We want to see what we're going to do with this function. So the only thing I have right now is just the console log the session was counted. Now, we want this to only execute once. How do we go about solving that problem? Think about how you might go about solving that problem. Now, there are probably several different approaches, but I think a common approach for most people that aren't familiar with a functional approach is to go in and edit this function. Edit the function, make some changes, modify it so that the code inside here will only happen once. Well, an FP approach may be to create another function that we can pass this function into, and the result of passing this function into will return a function that will only invoke this once. So that way we don't change this function at all. We create a second function, and the purpose of that function is to be used whenever we want something done just once. And we can pass any number of functions in there. It wouldn't just be this one, it could be other functions that we only want invoked once. So let's go ahead and set up that function. I'm going to call it only once because that's really what it does. And as I said, we are going to receive a function as a parameter. So I'm going to store that in the fn variable here. All right, let me put in the curly braces. This is going to have several lines to it. So we want curly braces for this arrow function. Now, the first thing I want to set up is I'm going to create a variable here. And whoops, I'm going to call it once. And we're going to set this equal to false. This is the variable we're going to track to see if this function has already been invoked or not. Okay, so whatever function is passed in here, if once is true, then it's already been invoked. We won't invoke it again. Now, as I said in solving this problem, we're going to return a function. We're going to return a function, and that will be the function that we count sessions with if we only want it done once. If we want it done whenever we call it, then this is the one we would use. All right, so let's go ahead and return that function. So return, and here is where I'm going to use the rest operator. Okay, because I said we're not creating this just for the count session function. There could be any function that's passed in there. Well, we want to make sure whatever we return can handle the parameters that are intended for the function passed in. And so we're going to gather those using the rest syntax. We're going to gather those into the args variable there. Okay. Now let's set up our function. And here's what we're going to do. If once is equal to false, that's what we're checking there, then we'll go ahead and set once equal to true, so it's not going to be invoked again, and we'll invoke the function. Now, how are we going to invoke that function? Well, we've gathered the parameters that are passed in right here. So we then want to spread them out again. We've gathered them into an array, args. We don't want to pass an array into this function because we don't know that it accepts an array. We just know that it accepts the parameters that have been sent in. So we spread them out. Do you see the logic of that? Do you see why we use the rest and spread operator here? We grab them together into a single variable, and then we spread them back apart when we invoke that function. We don't know how many arguments there's going to be. We have no idea. And so we just deal with them this way so that we don't lose an argument. They're still passed to the function. Whatever function we choose to send into this, they're still passed there, and it should work for us. All right? All right, now, so this is our function. We've got it set up. Now let me talk about a few other things we have in here. I've mentioned the rest and spread syntax, but we're also using closure. Notice this variable here is established inside this main function. And then this function is returned. And because of closure, it will still have access to it. All right? That's an important point to identify here is the way we're using closure. Also, this is a higher order function. We're receiving a function and we're returning a function. We're doing both things that constitute a higher order function, not just one of them, but we're doing both of them in this case. And we're also using arrow functions to define our functions simply because of the concise syntax, but also sometimes it's important because of how it binds this. All right, now let's go ahead and test this. So how do we go about testing this? Well, what we want to do is we want to get a new function. So I'm going to set up a new function here, this variable. Count session once is what I'm calling it. And the way we're going to get this function is we're going to call only once, and we're going to pass in count session. So we're going to invoke this, pass in this function. It's going to return this right here, which is a function. All right. And what is it going to do as a part of that function? Well, it's going to check if it's been called yet. If this one that was passed in, count session, has been called yet. If not, it will call it. Now that's also using closure as well. So I mentioned the once variable, but also we're using closure with the function that's passed in. All right. So there we've got it set up. This is now the new function we're going to use if we only want it counted once. So let me save that. And let's see, we're going to go here to the console. What I'm going to do is I'm going to count session one, not count session once. I'm going to invoke that. So when we invoke it, it says the session was counted. Now, if we invoke it again, we don't get that console log statement. And so it's keeping it to just being done once. Okay, so that's working for us. That worked great. And that's a little bit of a functional approach using functional techniques to solve this problem. Now, I'm going to expand on this example just a bit. What if we wanted to pass in two functions and say the first function, we want it to be invoked if it hasn't been invoked yet. But once it's invoked, then we want to invoke something else, maybe to give the user a message or something like that. So it's that kind of thing. So we want to pass in two functions. All right, so let's look at solving that now. So if I jump back here, let's talk about this. So do we want to go in and edit the only once function? No, we don't. This function is created for only once. And it has a single function brought in, and it will only execute that once. So if we want something else, let's create another function that we can use for that. So first, before we start creating that function, let me just put a second function. This is the one we want to be invoked once this one's already been called. Okay, so if that's been called once, we then want to invoke this, which we're just going to call it session counted. And what is it going to do? Well, simply, we're just going to do more console log stuff. We're not making these ones up here complex or anything because we're focusing on the process here. And we'll just log to the console that already done, something like that. So a message, basically. All right. All right, so this is the one we want invoked if this one's already run. Okay, so now let's set up a new function here that we'll use instead of only once. We can pretty much copy this because we're going to use a lot of this for this new function. And let's call it only once and then, because it's doing something. It's going to do something after the once has been called. It's going to invoke another function. And now we want two functions passed in, so I'll designate those with fn1 and fn2. We're still going to use let once equal false. We're still going to use this. And then what are we going to return? Well, we're same thing. We want to use the rest and spread operators here to take care of the arguments in case the functions we pass in have arguments. Now let's just change this if statement a bit. So if it's once, so if once equals true, this is where we're going to invoke the second function, right? And we're going to use the spread operator to spread out the arguments so that function receives it. Else, if it's the first time through, then we set once equal to true and we invoke fn1 with the arguments passed in. So as you can see, very similar function, and we could have easily updated this one, but you don't want to. We may want to use this function if we want something only once, but we don't want to call anything after that. So we have this one here. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to comment out this one, and this time we're going to get a new function, count session, and then this is the variable that will store the function that was returned, and we're going to call only once and then. And what are we passing in? We're passing in count session and session counted, like that. Those two functions we're passing in. All right, we're good there. Let's go ahead and save that. Let me just reduce this a bit, and let's go ahead and do some testing of this then. So if we call count session and then we invoke that, the first time through session was counted. If we invoke it again, it says already done. We continue to invoke it, and it says already done. All right. So now there's that example, our first example. Let me jump back to the code here so you can take a look at it. And you will have the files with this so you can study those in more detail. But I'd encourage you to take a moment and think about this approach. Think about how it is different than perhaps how you would have gone about solving it. This will get you started thinking in a functional way, and some of the things we'll be talking about will make more sense. All right, let's move on.